My name is Melanie Cunningham. I'm the Executive Director of NAMI Kentucky, and we are going to be presenting now our session 3B, and it is a new program to NAMI Kentucky. It's called Sharing Your Story with Law Enforcement, and it is a presenter program. So Steve Olshewsky is going to present today in the program, and he is a trained Sharing Your Story with Law Enforcement presenter through us. So we're super excited to hear his presentation, and then we can have our Q&A at the end. And like I said, this is a new program that we got last year. So Steve is one of the few people that we've trained, and we hope this is a long-lasting program with us. So without further ado, Steve, take it away. We want to hear your presentation and story about sharing your story with law enforcement.
Sure. I'm going to say that I'm on here twice, and there's a reason for that, but you see my picture, well, I'm pointing in a direction might be different for you, but anyway, it's interesting the different machines make my face look different, make my background look different, but it's the same bookcase. Anyway, so Melanie described this very well. I think that this is a program that NAMI has been doing, which is a training, and it was a one-day, all-day long workshop training. And before that, we did some homework, which is we wrote out our story and we were guided. It was very much like an online class where there was a little module maybe of instruction, and then we wrote out our own piece, and then there was a second section module and we wrote out, and so on like that. And then when we got together for the day, we had already done that, so we could discuss how we would use those pieces of our story and how to put it together. And then we got to practice telling our story and so on like that. So I very much recommend this program for anyone. One, I recommend the full-blown one-day training that I got a chance to do. And I would also suggest even just doing this module work, the online part. I think we could set that up anytime, one-on-one or in a small groups or online or anything, to talk about that in terms of reflection on our own story. And this is what it's about, our developing and understanding ourselves and our own story, also in a way that we can present and share our story with other people so they can relate to it, so they can understand us better, so we can understand ourselves and they can understand us better. And in that relationship and in that common understanding that we want to build, this reduces stigma, and that's a big thing that NAMI stands for, to reduce the stigma of mental health. And when we're dealing with law enforcement, we're talking about a power differential, of course, because the police officer has a job to do, and we have the situation of being subject to their authority in the job that they're doing. So the better they can understand us, and I'm going to say again, the better that we can understand ourselves and make ourselves understandable to law enforcement, the easier they can do their job in a way that satisfies the requirements of what they're trying to accomplish and help us in what we're trying to do, maybe mostly get on with our lives. So let me quickly overview and use myself as an example. I'll talk about the sections of the presentation that I would give to law enforcement, and I'll use myself as an example. So first I'm going to describe what it is, and then I'm going to say for myself. So the first section is about history and maybe difficult. Well, the first section actually is an introduction. And I want to, maybe I accidentally almost skipped that, but no, that might be the most important part. I have the advantage in this situation of having a bio published about me. You can see in my bio that I was a student and that I stayed in school long enough that they let me teach. I also like to garden. I live in Lexington and so on. And these things, by way of introduction and to start a presentation introducing, and you'll see that probably in every presentation today at this conference, people have their bio published, but they also introduce themselves. And that getting to know each other is the key to everything, because I want whoever I'm talking to, my audience, to be able to identify with me and see me as a human being and someone who is like them. And this is the key, I think, to influencing what NAMI calls advocacy. How do we advocate? Is by presenting ourselves and our story in a way that the audience, that the other person, whether it's a lawmaker, a police officer, a teacher, or anybody in the grocery store, or whoever we are trying to, just get to know or have a relationship with, if they can understand that I, Steve, am just like them. I'm exactly like them. In fact, I'm no different from them at all, except for maybe one little thing, which is, I have a mental illness. Now, is that such a big difference? No, not really. We're both gardeners. We're both used to go to school. We both have jobs. We both have to shovel our driveway because it snowed. We both have a long list of things in common. And exploring those areas of what we have in common help us to feel closer and connected in a way that we don't have that same stigma like, oh yeah, but he has a mental illness, so I'm going to put him aside and not care about him. In the case of law enforcement, it can be more difficult because the law enforcement is already worried that there might be a dangerous situation or something that is an emergency where they have to act. So the first thing in my if I were sitting in a room right now with law enforcement officers, I would want to introduce myself in a way they could understand. That is, I would say, I used to work in a hotel and I worked as the security person in the hotel, and that was my job. And it was very strange to me that there was a lot of downtime when I was sitting around, but at any second something could happen. And that the police officer can relate to that yes, that's what they do. They have a lot of downtime where they're sitting, but then at a moment's notice, something could happen that they might have to investigate and decide whether it's a problem or not. I used to do that kind of thing. They've also found that police officers do their job better if they have any education at all. And so a lot of police forces have offered pay incentives if they go back to school and such. And I used to be a student, and I was always, and now there's a very popular thing, forensics and criminal classes. And I went to Eastern Kentucky University to actually, I taught there a little bit, but that's not what I would say to a police officer. I went there to get trained on suicide prevention, and I was actually in the facilities that was built for training the state troopers in Kentucky. Have you ever been there? Well, of course, because all the police officers and state troopers have been through Eastern Kentucky University's beautiful facility. And then I could talk about, oh my goodness, what a nice building, plenty of parking and all that. And those kind of things that people can relate to. And then they go, well, maybe this guy is a little bit like me. I can hear him more on my own terms. And what's the main difference between us? Well, I have a mental illness, but it's not that big a deal. I'm mostly just like you. All right. The second section is about my mental illness and how I have suffered with that. And so what I would say about that is that I have anxiety, like in the extreme of having panic attacks. That is, if I'm not careful, it'll get out of control and I'll pass out. There's a medical term for that, which is syncope, S-Y-N-C-O-P-E, if you like medicine. But why does it have to be technical? I pass out, but then it's brief. I regain consciousness. Okay. And by the way, the first time that ever happened to me, I thought I was having a heart attack. And so I live over here by the University of Kentucky. And so that's also close to the hospital. And so it was easy for me to go over there and find out it wasn't a heart attack. And in fact, that I was having a panic attack. Well, you can imagine how that kind of crippling anxiety plays into any situation where I'm getting involved with the police. So for example, if I'm walking from, oh, this friend's house over to this friend's house, and I'm walking across campus, maybe without putting on my shoes, maybe with an open beer in my hand, you can imagine how easily a police officer might want to stop and say, is this guy okay? By the way, is this guy breaking the law? Well, yes, open beer container is breaking the law. And not wearing shoes is not what people normally do. And yet, I'm a student. And so how do I feel? One, I have every right in the world to walk from this friend's house to that friend's house, and I'm a student. And no, I don't have my student ID with me, but, you know, and now the police officer is asking me questions. And you can imagine how difficult that situation can become for me, but also for the police officer. And those are the kinds of situations I struggled with within myself, just trying to deal with, oh my goodness, I have an exam coming up and I got to stay up all night and study. But if I stay up all night, then I won't be fresh and smart in the morning. What am I going to do? What am I going to do? But also dealing with other people, and especially people in authority, like teachers or police officers or whatever. The second module, and the part that we wrote out then, is how I learned to deal with some of those crippling mental illnesses. And in my case, and I think I wrote this out in the bio, very simple, I went around and sought help and actively sought help from therapists. And I don't want to pick on people that have, you know, different training or educational backgrounds, whatever, but I didn't get any help. There was not a medicine that really helped me, and there was not a therapy that really helped me until I got into a anxiety support group, which was a NAMI group of people that suffered similar to me. And that's the peer-to-peer model of working with people like myself. And in that peer-to-peer setting, working with, or just meeting regularly once a week with people like me, I felt more accepted. I felt more like I could identify, and the thing I first said, I started seeing myself and other people as ordinary, normal, everyday people, just like anybody else, with possibly one little difference. And what's that one little difference that makes me unique? Well, I have a mental illness. I so happen to actually have a mental illness. But other than that, if I grow a tomato and you grow a tomato, those tomatoes look real similar. And let's talk about tomatoes, because that's something we have in common. Okay. Even today, my relationships that I've made, and that was say 12, 13 years ago, whatever, a lot of those relationships are very strong and stay in touch and work together and do different things like this and connect with, you know, inviting each other to the conference or whatever. So that worked out well for me in terms of my own struggles and how I was able to adapt and do well. And I also now, as another section, have hopes and dreams about the future. I find myself able to deal much better with my anxiety, and I find myself much better able to interact with police officers without losing my mind. And I'm saying that in a kind of a colloquial, you know, sort of a common language way. I kid you not, it was very hard for me to look at somebody wearing a uniform and not simply lose my mind. Because, oh no, what does this mean? And what's going to happen? And what do I have to do? And what are they going to do to me? What if they find out I have a mental illness? Will they throw me in the back of the car? You know, all that sort of stuff. I found that I've learned over the years how to deal with that a little better, and to go back to what I originally said. I want to impress upon anybody I'm talking to that I'm pretty much just like them, and they're pretty much just like me. And there's not that much difference between us. So that's sort of the message of all this, I think. My story is probably a lot like yours. And when you break it up and look at it, I started off in life, some struggles. I didn't even know what was going on. I had to figure out I had a mental illness and what does that mean? I had to deal with that. I had to deal with that in some way. And I learned and grew and eventually got better at dealing with that. And now I'm in a situation where I feel like I might be able to share my successes with other people in a productive way. And that's what I'm doing right now. And I've had, by the way, I teach over here at the university now. I teach accounting, by the way, which is a boring thing, but I get police officers all the time in my classes because they do have this incentive that they get a pay raise if they take so many classes. And so it doesn't matter what classes, so they want to take something practical. Learning how to balance your bank book, learning how to do your taxes seems like a practical thing to do. So they'll take, if I teach a night class that's convenient to their schedule, then they show up in class with me. And it's an opportunity. I'm the teacher, they're the student, but also I'm able to have them as an audience where I can explain to them. It's not easy for a person to look at somebody in a uniform and not feel anxiety. And if a person has a mental illness, that anxiety pushes them over the edge. Just being around a police officer can do it. I've had that experience. Now, what does that mean for you and me and how we're trying to talk to each other? Well, hopefully, we see each other as similar and we can treat each other in a humane and calm and decent way. I'll mention quickly that it came up in our training that Kentucky, this is what they told us, Kentucky is the only state in the United States, the trainer I think was out of Chicago. I think Kentucky is the only state in the United States that mandates crisis intervention training for the police, And yet there's no funding allocated for that. So there's no program in place because they don't have the funding to actually have a formal program. Well, what does that say to people like me? That they need the police force and the lawmakers, people who make the laws, need for people like me and people like everyone who comes to this conference to step up in terms of advocacy, in terms of putting our story out there and saying, I've had struggles with mental illness. Those struggles didn't defeat me. I had to struggle and learn how to deal with them. And to some degree, not perfectly, but to some degree, I have learned a little bit how to deal with my mental illnesses. And now I can talk to you maybe like there's not that much difference between us. And why would I be treated any different? Why should there be a stigma and so on? All right. Well, I was only going to talk for 15 minutes and I've already gone past that. This is the curse of somebody. Yes. This is part of my anxiety. I just get started and can't stop. But I want to be open to questions. And I see some names that I might or might not recognize. And so I'm going to open if there's any questions or discussion. And there's a chat feature. And we were talking earlier, I know people, there's a group at the dry dock in Richmond who said that they'd want to join, but they wouldn't be able to interact because they're busy setting up for an event.
Mm-hmm. Let me see. I don't see any questions in the chat. I guess my question, I have two. So since your training, have you made any arrangements to talk to a CIT training program? I know that they have those all across the state, so you don't want to drive down Western, but there should be something like local, like maybe even Richmond, where the police academy is, Lexington. I went to one, actually, myself and one of my board members, he lives up in Pike County. He met me there. We went to one in Hazard. So I drove down to a church where the police were being trained the whole week. And then the last day they were doing some presentations. So I went up there and we set up a table so they could get mental health information. And we talked about NAMI, myself, and then like at that time, the president of NAMI Hazard. and one of my board members. So we had lunch with them and everything. So I was just wondering if you've been able to do that so far.
I have not been able to do that, and I really want to.
Okay.
I want to say that I use COVID as an excuse for almost everything. And there's several things like that I want to do. I also want to get in, I want to get into the prisons. I want to talk to prison guards and administrators and wardens. I believe, this is a little bit on the tangent, but I believe that the law enforcement situation, one of the bad parts for people with mental illness is that they get trapped in a system where they might actually go to jail. I mean, that can happen. And then they might get out of jail, sometimes after a few days, a few weeks, or who knows. But when they get out of jail, that reentry is a critical time for people to get, anyone who comes out of the prison system, to get support and to get, a little direction and guidance, and a little bit of what I said. Like, let's remind ourselves and each other, you're not that different from everybody else. You got a little bit of a problem, maybe. You just got out of jail or whatever. Or you walked across campus barefooted with an open beer or whatever. But that little thing shouldn't defeat you for life. And so I want to work with, I ultimately want to work with a lot of people. And so the problem is that the prison system with COVID has said, well, we're not just going to let people casually come in and visit. Well, of course not. And so I feel a little bit like, I don't know what I would have to do or where I would have to go to get plugged into that system. But I would like to, and Melanie, you're the contact I would look to. I've been to, Hazard's an interesting place. I've been there a few different times. And once was to speak, I was invited to come down and speak to it was an open session that they were talking about, I think it was Medicaid or something, coverage for mental illness. And they wanted me to come down and tell my story, much like you've heard pieces of my story today. And they wanted me, I think I had 5 minutes. I think they allocated 5 minutes to everybody who, whatever. And I think I had 5 minutes to tell them, basically, I'm just like you all. But if I want, I've done this, by the way, I've actually done this. I've walked up to the pharmacy counter and said, I'm here to pick up my prescription. And they said, well, that'll be $13.78 or whatever. And I'd say, oh, never mind, and walk off and just turn around and walk away. I mean, that actually happened to me. And then they actually yelled, wait. And then they gave it to me for, like, I forget, $3 or whatever, how much I had on me. My point is, the pharmacy was very nice to me in that case. But in this business that I'm talking about, I told that story from my own personal experience and said, can you relate to what it might be like to need a medication for diabetes or cholesterol or blood pressure, and you don't have the money, and the pharmacy, what if they didn't give you your medication?
Correct.
Because you didn't have the money. Now, come on, Medicaid. Right. Come on, Medicaid. You got to cover some of these. And anyway, and so I spent 5 minutes doing that. And Hazard's interesting. There's a lot of advocacy going on now.
Yeah.
And we need more of that all around the state.
Yeah, we do. So that I said I had 2 questions, and then and I can, we get invitations, we get people who request, like police departments. So especially if a request comes and it's not like, 3 hours to drive there, I definitely will let you know. And then I guess my other question with the sharing your story with law enforcement is that, do you see that similar to In Our Own Voices, or what's the piece that's a little bit different with the law enforcement?
There's another program, In Our Own Voice, that I've also been part of, and I used to go to the Ridge, by the way,
and do those.
Yeah, and I did those. They had an outpatient. The Ridge has an outpatient program, intensive outpatient, and they also have inpatient. And so I've done both. I've done inpatient and outpatient. Anyway, and that is an audience of people who are, like I described, maybe they're in a situation where their mental illness has taken them where they're in that struggling to try and do better. And what I call reentry, when they come back to a job, paying rent, trying to get along with your family. I mean, all these things, transportation, I mean, all these things are stressors. So I want to talk to them directly about how, yeah, I know what stressors are. Believe me, it can be crippling. On the other hand, with law enforcement, they're doing what they have jobs. They have transportation. They have internet connection. They have everything they need. They have relationships. Me too. I want you to identify with me as a person who has a job in this and this. That doesn't mean I don't have a mental illness, and that doesn't mean I should be treated differently. And that doesn't mean that anybody should. And that, and so it is a different audience. But the message, I want to make it clear, I think the message is the same. We're all not that much different.
Yeah. So you've got more of this professional audience that you're speaking to that happen to be police officers who are engaging in a lot of mental health interventions that they don't necessarily want to, but when things happen, they get called and they have to respond. Right. So,
yes. Yeah. I, by the way, I'm going to mention this as another quick aside. I'm also I have worked and I am working with a lot of emergency medicine crews, by the way, because they've invited me to talk about things which are what happens when a person has hypoglycemia or they've had a traumatic experience like a car wreck where they're going into shock versus what if they have a mental illness? How do we know and how do we treat people this way? So that's another interesting area of that. I want to say I want to wind this up and say for the police, and your question, I've heard it called code switching, and I've been told I'm an excellent code switcher. That I know how to put on a suit and tie, and I know how to put on a flannel shirt, and I know how to tell my audience, well, you got a garden. What do you grow? Flowers? You grow tomatoes? Me too. I'm just like you.
Yeah, thank you. Does anybody else have any questions? Jonathan or Trevor, Leslie, or comments?
Comments, questions, or I'm certainly glad you could attend. I've heard that people were talking about attending and not being able to participate because they were doing something else. And if this has been in the background and a little bit of what I said creeped in or seeped in, I'll take it. I've done a lot of work, by the way, on Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C. and also in Frankfurt. And the lobbying motto that I've heard that I like is no witness for conscience is ever lost. If you are talking to somebody about something you believe in, even if they're on the other side of the room doing something else, you're sending out your message is a good thing. So I encourage everyone. I think there's a need for that. I encourage everyone to step up and say, I'm here just like you, like anybody else.
Okay, well, I know that you and I think maybe I'm supposed to stay in this same room, but maybe not. I don't know. We've got Kyle next, and he's going to do one of the other NAMI signature programs in the silence. So without further ado, we will close with Steve. And if you signed up to hear Kyle, I don't know if we stay in the same room. I'm going to go out and then see if it just says Kyle for 3C. He was doing that in the silence with social anxiety. So, but thank you, Steve, for your presentation, and anything that comes up around this area, I definitely will give you a call to present.
Please do. Yeah, please do.
Okay.
Always happy to join you, Melanie. Thanks so much.
Okay. All right. Thank you. You have a good one.